Hey, and welcome back. So we just got done talking about the need to search for different options to our solutions, right? We don't want to get locked into our initial hypothesis of what we think will work. We're going to test that out later. What we need to do is come up with a couple different options and really like push our creativity to figure out different ways that we could solve the problem, right? So we can test our assumptions, test our hypotheses, and make sure that we're building the right thing in the long run. And if we're only testing one thing, we have nothing to compare it against. So it's good to be able to even compare different options of a solution to a particular problem, as well as trying to prioritize amongst different problems, right? Because once we actually prioritize the problem, then we need to figure out what solution's best. So um, I like to come up with at least a couple, well, at least two different um, diagrams of how we could solve it, and maybe a couple low fidelity prototypes. And the reason for this isn't so that way we can go build multiple things. The reason why we do this is to have a conversation, right? In agile product management, part of the agile manifesto is we want to have uh, working software over extensive documentation, right? And the whole thing about agile stories is we want to be able to have a conversation, right? So before we get to the stories are really, and we'll get to this later in the course too, but stories are written, and acceptance criteria is written once you know what problem you're going to solve and how you're going to solve it, right? Um, because the way it plays out in practice is acceptance criteria is written for the stories, to kind of detail out how you're going to solve the problem. Stories can be written well in advance. They're abstract enough to where it's just basically calling out the problem that you're going to solve. um, and the purpose of those are to have conversations. So this kind of is coupled with the story. And in reality, the problem statement is really just is another way of writing your story, right? So if we go back to the problem statement so let's go back here. So I have to use and pay for ProtoPie to get pro level animations to finish my Figma prototype. Um, you know, we'll get to this later, but I'll give it to you now because it's relevant. The story would be, as Jocelyn, the animated agency designer, I have to use and pay for ProtoPie so I can get pro level animations to finish my Figma prototype. Right, so that's your problem statement, and that's written in kind of the same typical pattern that a story is written. And so the story could be, as Jocelyn, the animated agency designer, I need pro level animations in Figma so I don't have to continue paying for ProtoPie, a third party system that has nothing to do with Figma, right? So just as an example, right off the top of my head, of how you could turn this problem statement into a story, basically using the exact same information from the problem statement, right? But the point of this is to have a conversation. Okay, we're not declaratively saying how we're going to solve it. We just are trying to have a conversation with our developers and our designers on the problem, who's having the problem, and the fact that we need to fix that problem, right? So if we come back here, I try to diagram out the user flow. So where do they uncover the problem, and what might we do about it, right? To try to overcome that problem. And then, you're most likely you're going to be working with an existing product. If you're going down the path where you're building your own product, you might have lower fidelity wireframes and mockups, which don't need any type of like color or design pattern like material design or anything like that. It can be really rough. But if you're working with an existing product, screenshots work really well. Okay, and I'll get into the details of what these things are. It's not relevant here. The point that I want you to take away from this section in diagrams and prototypes or mock-ups is that these are tools used to have a conversation. Okay, there's been many times where I've gone to my developers and my designers with mock-ups of saying, hey, here's the problem, and here's just a rough idea of how I see us solving it. Um, and it becomes a collaboration between me and the designer of the user experience, and they own obviously like the more technical design stuff. But some of the feedback I'm looking for from my developers are, you know, is this a smart way to solve the problem? Um, because the developer really needs to define how you're going to solve it. What you're solving, you own. That's your job as the product manager. The technical aspect of how you implement the solution is really owned by the developer, right? And so there was a feature about a year ago that I was working on, and I pulled up this diagram, and I had some mock-ups, and I was explaining, hey, here's the problem, here's the solution that we've prioritized for this problem, and here's kind of how I see it playing out at a high level. And the developer stepped in and said, we could do it that way, and it would take about 6 weeks to do. But if we leverage some existing capabilities we have and do it this way, then it would take about a week to implement. I'm like, well, crap. Let's do the thing that takes a week, because the outcome was the exact same. And that's the benefit of having these conversations, is your developers can help define how that will be implemented from early on, versus saying, here's a story, here's the acceptance criteria, go do it, which some product managers do. And it's not the smartest way to go about it, because it's going to add extra time, most likely, to the developer's plate, without them having input early on. Okay, so that's the real value you get out of this, is one, everyone feels bought in to the process, because everyone's kind of brainstorming on the how to implement the solution. So remember, your job is to define what the problem is, what's going to be prioritized to solve it, and then you use tools like this, diagrams and prototypes, to have conversations, or to start the conversation of how might we solve this problem. And that becomes a team decision, based on different inputs and subject matter expertise, right? So that's what I want you to get out of this. These tools, and I build diagrams in Figma, just because why would I use another system when I can I can use the same thing I'm using for mockups to actually diagram things out. And I do mockups in Figma too, and then I work with our designers to also do mockups and high fidelity designs once we're ready to actually implement something in real code. So yeah, use these tools to have a conversation. It doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to spark a conversation. We'll get into the details of what we're actually trying to solve for and what I did here in the next session of validating desirability. And I'll share my thoughts behind how I'm going to try to validate desirability for this particular problem with Figma. But what I want you to do is create some diagrams and mockups. Now that you've identified some problems that you could solve, go and make 1 or 2 diagrams for how you, like the user flow. That's what the diagrams are, is for the user flow of how, of what the user's journey is getting from point A to point B. Where does the problem occur, and what are some ideas you have to solve that problem in that space where that problem occurs. Okay, and then if you can grab some screenshots from that product and maybe mock up the visual aspects of that part of the user journey, that visual aspect really helps things for individuals who are more visual than abstract thinkers. So with that, go ahead, create that. It's really good to show, and it's really good practice for what you would be doing in your real day-to-day. And with that, I'll see you in validating desirability.